Hello everyone and a very warm welcome to this ICAS webinar, CyberScotland Week Understanding Responsibilities for Cyber Security Governance. For those that haven't joined us before, I'm David Mingus, Director of Practice here at ICAS, and it's my great pleasure to be guiding you through this afternoon's webinar. Cyber attacks shut down organisations and are now one of the most serious threats to the accountancy profession and business in general. As a result, they need to be very much towards the top of your risk register. Attackers and the techniques that they use are sophisticated, ever evolving, and of course defending against them is highly complex. Businesses who don't give this serious consideration and put into effect mitigation really are putting their businesses at risk, and a serious breach can have devastating consequences. That's why ICAS is delighted to be taking part in Cyber Scotland Week, which is focusing this year on the theme of actions to take to improve cyber resilience. But whose responsibility is it for cybersecurity, and why should those in charge of governance within an organisation take an interest? After all, it's just an IT problem, isn't it? Well, hopefully over the next 50 minutes or so, we might be able to help you come to the correct answer on that as we look at the UK government's proposed cyber governance code of practice, some regulatory considerations and key factors to be taken into account by the ICO for non-compliance, and how senior leaders can understand better the role they play in their company's cybersecurity strategy. And to help us unpack all of that, I'm delighted to be joined today by Kerry Mackin, a director of Mitigo, who is ICAS's cybersecurity partner as part of our Evolve programme of practice support. Mitigo's experience in protecting professional services firms and other businesses enables Kerry to highlight common vulnerabilities and explain how to implement a proportionate risk management framework. Kerry believes that the challenges of cybersecurity, business resilience, and legal and regulatory compliance needn't keep business leaders awake at night. It's just a matter of matching the right solution to the problem. Kerry spent the last 2 decades helping businesses identify their exposure to risk and has a keen eye for detail that has enabled him to deliver robust packaged solutions that provide real protection, allowing businesses to get on with what they do best at. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping matters to remind you of. You're able to submit questions at any time through the Q&A facility, which can be accessed at the top of your screen. Questions can be submitted anonymously, so we'll be saving all your questions until the end of the webinar for the live Q&A section. You can also join in the conversation today through the chat box, and that is also accessible at the top of your screen. This allows you to comment or discuss with fellow attendees on any of the matters covered by today's webinar. We are also recording this webinar and we'll be making it available for on-demand viewing afterwards in case you want to refer it back to it or indeed share it with others. And of course, slides will be available after the event as well, and you'll be able to contact the ICAS events team to obtain a copy of those if necessary. There are going to be a couple of polls appearing on your screens throughout this webinar, and you'll be able to access either of them on the screen, or for some people, depending upon how your organisation is set up, the poll will appear within the chat box at the top of your screen. So please do take the time to respond to those polls, as we want to make this session as interactive as possible. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand across to Kerry to start taking us through this. Over to you, Kerry.
Thanks very much, David, and good afternoon, everybody. So welcome. For those of you that have joined the webinars that we've done before, you'll know a little bit about Mitigo. We are a cyber risk management firm, so we're not an IT company. What we do is help businesses understand their cyber risk in order that they can manage it and control it properly and appropriately. And one of the big areas that we get involved with is governance. And we thought, rather than talk to you as we have done before about ransomware attacks and email account takeovers, these things are rampant, as we'll find out as we go through this. There's actually quite a lot changing in the world, certainly from an expectation from the government on what's required of senior leaders, board members with regards to cyber governance. So it seemed a good topic for us to talk about in Cybersecurity Week. Before we do that, I've got a couple of polls just to wet your whistle. So I think the first poll will come up on screen any moment now, I'm hoping. So just bear with us. So I think that is now, there we go. I think we can start to see that. Just bear with me because the one person that can't. So how would you best describe your cyber security governance? So it's in the meeting chat where I can see it. So you got the options. Brilliant. It's all in hand. Not bad. It could be better. It's non-existent, or your IT deal with that. So let's just give it a second. There's about 44 people currently in the room, so let's wait for a few more. We've got 25 so far that have responded. I shall make a note. So currently we've got one that says it's brilliant and all in hand. 22 of you saying could be better. So none of you are non-existent, and then 3 saying that your IT deal with that. Okay, so thank you very much. I suppose what we'll find out as we go through this is that this is your IT can play part of this, but actually it needs to be led by the organisation, and it's going to become more and more important to do so. And having the right guidance, obviously, is what most people are after. So that's the first poll. If we could have the second poll up, please, Florian. And here it is. So if you experienced a major cyber event today, how confident are you in your incident response plan working? And so we've got the options there of very confident, we test it regularly, somewhat confident, we have one, but it's not tested, we don't have a plan, or our IT deal with it. So let's have a look. So 2 are confident. 3, I'm going to give that a second. So 3 are very confident. 12 are somewhat confident, so that's about half of the people responding. 6 don't have a plan. Okay, and 5 are that the IT are dealing with it. Okay, so thank you for that. Again, it gives us good insight into it. And again, your IT will play part of the incident response, but it's a much wider piece than that. And as I go through the presentation, you'll get to perhaps just recognize where you should be involved quite a lot more than just leaving it to your IT. Those that don't have a plan, the 6 of you, I can promise you the time to start writing one is not at the point of having a cyber breach. You really are best to have that. And certainly the 3 that have said that they test it regularly and they're very confident, unfortunately, that is the right answer, because really it's good to have, it's not only good to have the plan, but you do need to test it to see if it works. And very often you'll find that there'll be an element of the plan that doesn't work. But as we go through today's session, I'll explain some of the components that you should be considering to make sure that you've got all your bases covered. So on with the action-packed show, and just onto the agenda. I mean, look, you know the agenda, it's been published, and so we'll just push on, I think. So what is the Cyber Governance Code of Practice, and when is it going to come in? So back in January in 2024, so just over a year ago, the government, so it's DSIT, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, published a call for views on a code of practice, and they put out some ideas of what they thought that this could look like. And fast forward a year, and the reason it's taken a year is obviously because we've had a general election in between, so it slowed things down. But DSET have turned around and said, you know, no, we're definitely going to publish it. There's going to be a few minor tweaks, and they released that information, as I say, last month. But effectively, what is it? Well, the Cyber Governance Code of Practice formalises the government's expectations regarding an organisation's governance of cybersecurity and sets out clear actions that directors, non-execs need to take to meet their responsibilities in managing cyber risk. So apologies to read it out. I'll be doing a bit of reading today. There's quite a lot of detail in the slides today, because there is quite a lot of information, and I thought it might be handy if you want a copy of the slides afterwards, that these could be useful for you. So that's that, and it's going to be published. The best we've got at the moment is early 2025. I mean, crikey, we're at the end of February, so I'm assuming within the next month or so, so probably the end of Q1 is where we're thinking. So let's crack on. Why have they done it? Well, I'm going to show you some stats in a moment, but to take some of the some language from the code, they're saying it's apparent that board and senior leaders still struggle to engage with cyber issues because of a lack of understanding. Certainly those that are only relying on their IT provider, and this isn't a slur on IT providers, by the way. We work alongside IT providers to help them put the right controls in place. But actually, because it's a wider scope than just IT, you've got to look outside of that scope, as will become apparent. That's kind of where businesses are falling down because they just keep leaving it to the technology firms, which you can see there in the second line. They often have little or no meaningful oversight of the technologies, because in point 3 they delegate it across to technical experts, and so you've got to look at it as a wider business risk management. And indeed, you know, what this is saying, what other publications are coming from the government, is they're now saying quite obviously, if cyber isn't in one of your top 3 on your risk registers, then it really should be, if not at the top at the moment. And the funny thing about the code, I say the funny thing, but the point about the code is they are also saying is, if there is not a large uptake of the code and they don't see that businesses are taking it seriously, this could be a step towards legislation. Because remember, a code of practice is voluntary, but I'll talk a little bit about voluntary code of practices and in context and why it's important as we go on. So if we just take a look at some of the statistics that are available, and one of them is a great source of information, is the UK Government Cyber Breach Survey of 2024. So there were nearly 8 million cybercrimes, reported cybercrimes in the UK in 2024. 50% of UK businesses experienced a breach or an attack of some sort last year. Therefore, it's only reasonable to expect that this year you've a 1 in 2 chance of becoming, the victim of a cybercrime. If we look at ransomware attacks, generally 3 weeks is pretty much the average downtime. So if your systems are encrypted, the chances are you'll be down for about 3 weeks. Average ransom payments last year, according to the National Crime Agency, were £1.5 million. That's not worth saying too slowly, is it? £1.5 million as a ransomware payment. And yet, if you really want to work out why it's a problem, is 83% of businesses in the cyber breach survey haven't carried out a cybersecurity vulnerability audit. Therefore, what are the chances of you really understanding where your vulnerabilities lie if you haven't carried out any form of assessment? And again, I take that back to, if it's just being left to IT, which in our experience, a lot of businesses do that, then that can cause all manner of problems for you. And of course, those that answered that they didn't have a formal incident response plan, unfortunately, you're not alone. About 80% of businesses that respond to the survey answer the same. But again, and I'll say it more than once through this, please, if you don't have one, get one. If you don't know how to do it, get some help, because it's vital. So let's start setting the scene a little bit. So we understand it's a code of practice. We understand it's going to come in the next month or so, and we'll get into the detail of what that looks like in a moment. But I want to put some context around it, kind of well, what are you already required to do, if you like, by law, by regulation, legislation? So we can look, and I'm not going to go through the entire code of ethics because I don't think we need to from ICAS, but certainly if we look at some of the fundamental principles on screen there, confidentiality, keeping your client's data confidential, professional behaviour, to comply with relevant laws. And if we start to take a look at where organisations are penalised and fined, generally it's a breach of GDPR. So if you look at, and I've done here a broad summary of Article 32, by law, if you carry personal data, and most of you will as an organisation, you're obliged to conduct a risk assessment for the security of that personal data that you hold. You are obliged to implement effective controls. And this is where it starts to sort of explain why it's not just technology and it's a wider scope than that. So you've got to understand what your people do, what the behaviours of your people are. You have to understand what your business processes are and where they could be potentially risky. You have to start considering things like your supply chain, because obviously you're receiving data from people and passing that on, and you have various suppliers, clients, customers, and the like. And so those controls have to be around people, they have to be around technology, and there has to be a regime of governance that sit upon it. So the requirement to have a regime of governance already exists. It's just that most people don't consider that. And of course, if we go on, it does say that you should be testing your controls and you should be reassessing, reevaluating the effectiveness of those controls over time. Why is that important? Because cyber crime adapts, it changes. You know, remember, every time you put something in place to try and prevent some form of cyber attack, you know, criminals have to work out how to get around it, and they're very cunning. And remember, that's their job, it's what they do. And so, you know, one really easy example of that is, I guess 2 or 3 years ago, maybe we would have been having questions, you know, do you use multi-factor authentication, MFA? And some people would say yes, and some people would say no. Most businesses now, most people on this call, this session today, will be saying, yes, we've got MFA in place. Great. But criminals have started to work out pretty easily how to get around that. I'm not saying you shouldn't have it, because it's one of the layers that you should be deploying, but there are several other factors that you need to consider as part of that robust protection. And so it's always changing. You always have to evaluate and you always have to assess, and that's what the law's asking you for here. And of course, you should be keeping evidence of that as well. And let's not just think, you know, in terms of regulation and legislation. You know, you run or you own a business if you're on this call, and the chances are you've got a reputation. You've spent many years trying to build that reputation, get your clients. You need to be resilient. You want to protect that reputation. You want to protect your staff, and you want to protect your clients. So, you know, there's moral and commercial obligations there as well. So it's only voluntary, as I've said, and so I guess it does beg the question is, well, if it's only voluntary, why should I bother doing it? Well, we've just talked about it in the context of regulation, if you like, but actually there are lots of other voluntary codes that exist. So some of you on here will have heard of Cyber Essentials. Some of you may indeed have Cyber Essentials. Some of you may have the certification for ISO, which is 27,001, not 270,001. Obviously, there's National Cybersecurity Centre guidance, there's NIST, there are various other codes as well. And the reason why it's important is because in context, the ICO often take into account voluntary standards when they are assessing the merits of a judgment of, say, a firm that has been breached, where their data has been breached. And I'm just going to bring up a couple of cases which are they're quite famous, and they're in different sectors, completely different sectors to accountancy, but the point is they're also in different sectors as well. So Tuckers are a law firm in London, and they were fined £98,000 as a result of a ransomware attack where data was breached and then published out onto the dark web, which is a very common occurrence in some form of ransomware attack. But in deciding the measures that they took upon them, they said, you know, let's look at the relevant standards of good practice. And they talked about voluntary codes, the ones that I've just talked about, 27,001 NIST, guidance from the ICO themselves, the National Cybersecurity Centre, Lexel if you're in law, which they are, Cyber Essentials itself. They also talked about their own policies not being adhered to. So the issue here is that, you know, this guidance exists and they're expecting organizations to already be looking at it. And obviously they're finding that they're not. The other thing that they moved on to, so moving from voluntary codes into regulation, the SRA had a code of conduct. And again, it was is similar to the codes of ethics, if you like, which is to sit there talking about that you should have effective governance structures. You must keep up to date with your legal obligations. You must identify risks, and safeguard clients' money, and so on and so forth. So, they're looking at that and saying these are the things that you should be doing. These are the things that you should be considering. And if you're not doing that and you have a breach, then we're going to hold you to account on that. Interserve was a far bigger fine because Interserve were a lot bigger. They were fined £4.4 million. And again, in looking at the penalties that they wanted to impose, they looked at it and said, well, you didn't really you had systems. What was different about Interserve is they had policies and systems in place, certainly around cyber. They had a lot more in place because they were a bigger organization, but they weren't even managing the business to their own standards. But again, they mentioned NIST, they mentioned NCSC, guidance from the ICO, and even software providers saying, look, Microsoft, McAfee, things that they were using had given warnings and nobody had really listened to it. But they then moved on, and this is kind of where you start to see more governance-related context, that they'd seen no evidence of management oversight or reviews. So again, alluding to the fact that leaving this to your IT provider will not be accepted when they're looking to, take issue with you. And so on and so forth. They don't have an information security program, didn't have a set of technical organizational measures. But I think that kind of makes the point, is if you have a breach and it's reportable to the ICO, it stands to reason that they're going to add the code of practice, the governance code of practice, to the list of things that they will consider in taking action against any firms that breaches GDPR going forward. So that's why we think that this is going to be critical for businesses to adhere to. So let's have a look. There's only 5 themes to the proposed, I say only, but there are 5 main themes to the proposed code. So you can read them yourself, and I'm going to go through each one now to give you a flavour of what's included and some of the thoughts and considerations that you need to give those as we go through. So the first one is risk management. So the principles, there are 5 principles. Now, these may change slightly. As I said, the DSET have turned around and said there might be some minor modifications. So this is what we know at the moment. So first action, identify and prioritize important digital processes, information and services critical to the ongoing operation. 2, conduct regular risk assessments and implement mitigations, internal, external and regulatory environments. Establish what level of cybersecurity risk is acceptable. Establish ownership of risks with seniors beyond the CISO, and ensure cybersecurity risks associated with supplier stakeholders and business partners is routinely assessed. So again, I know this is probably quite small writing on the screen, but if in downloading this afterwards, it might be useful. I've put some thoughts and considerations onto this. So, if you're going to do a risk assessment, what's the scope of your risk assessment? Because you've got lots of business processes, and remember, a lot of this falls outside of IT's remit. If you start to think about ISO 27001, NIST, Cyber Essentials, the Code of Ethics, what you start to recognize is this isn't your IT's, this isn't within their remit, this is not what you're asking them to do. And that's why it shouldn't just be left to them, because it is a far wider scope. Who's responsible on point 2? Who's going to carry out those risk assessments? Who is capable of doing that? Who's got the right expertise? Because obviously, if you're looking at in relation to regulatory environments, you need somebody that's going to understand that, somebody that understands your business's organization, that understands other forms of voluntary codes. And again, just to keep highlighting the point, this is something you need to contend with, and you need some advice on it if you don't know what you're doing, because it's not an IT thing. Establish what level this is a really good question. What level of cybersecurity risk is acceptable to you? I think very often what we see with organizations is they have software that is recommended to them that says, look, if we put this in place, this is going to do this. So, for example, it might encrypt your email so that that data is kept safe. So you might say, well, that's a good thing to have. But there will be other risks that you need to consider, and you need to consider whether you do or don't do something. And to go through a proper risk assessment process would allow you to make informed decisions as opposed to just putting some form of generic software package into the business, which may not actually manage problem that you've got effectively, or the ones that you don't know that you've got because you've not gone through the process in the first instance. Ownership, as it says, establish ownership of risks with seniors beyond the CISO. So I think that's just the essence of the code, isn't it? Is there needs to be people at a managerial or board leadership level that are involved in this and have a say in what's going on, and then that leads on to security risks associated with supply chain stakeholders and business partners. The truth here is we're seeing more and more questionnaires being placed by people within supply chain if they're sharing data, and so this will just keep going more and more, because we see a lot of the problems arising from weaknesses within the supply chain. So it ends up in your within your organization because of somebody that you work with. So you need to understand what you're looking for from partners that you work with from a security perspective, what questions you're going to ask them, and what responses, to understand the responses that they give you. Because of course, if they give you an answer to a question, you need to know whether that's a good answer or a bad answer. Here we start to get into in cyber strategy. I mean, they had this as number 2, but you could easily put this as the first part and interchange what we've just read. 3 actions from it. So monitor and review the cyber resilience strategy in accordance with the level of accepted cyber risk, the business strategy, and then in the context of legal and regulatory obligations. So that's kind of overarching what we've just read. If you think about it, is ongoing risk assessment, who's capable of doing them, what does it actually mean in relation to you remaining compliant with your own obligations and requirements. Number 2, monitor and review cyber resilience strategy in line with current business risks and in the context of the changing risk environment. AI is a huge thing that we get asked about all the time now, but that's not the only type of cyber risk that is evolving. That the methods that they use just keep on changing, as I've already mentioned, just with a very easy example of MFA is, you know, you can't do this once, you have to keep doing it. We've seen too many organizations that have actually bothered to go and carry out a risk assessment, and then they put in the controls that they have at this point, and then they think, well, we've done that, we've spent the money, we've invested our time and energy, and then we're okay now, aren't we? The problem is the landscape changes, and as that changes, you need to understand what those changes are, what those new threats look like, and then adapt yourself. And that's what the code is asking you to do, is to make sure this is an ongoing process. And then number 3, ensure appropriate resources and investment are allocated and used effectively to develop capabilities that manage cybersecurity threats and associated business risks. This kind of just highlights the point that I was making a moment ago, is you should have budget, and I'm sure most of you have spent money or intend to spend money or do spend money in this area, but we see so many organizations spending money on the wrong solutions, or when they put the solution in place, which could actually be a good one, it isn't set up in line with what the business risk is. Therefore, it's not doing the job that you want it to do. And I think that's probably the biggest crime of all, is investing money into something that actually isn't going to help you. So good, capable specialist advice is what we'd recommend there, but it all has to stem from getting your risk assessment carried out in the first instance. Number 3 is people. So you ask anybody, certainly in IT, what's the biggest risk you've got, and everybody will say, well, it's the people, isn't it? They click on things that you don't want them to click on and do things that you don't want them to do. So okay, let's accept that that's true, which I think it is. So we have to bring the people on the journey with us, and again, they've put 4 pretty simple actions into here, but I say simple, but not always easy to achieve. So communicate the importance of cyber resilience to the business. So what is your culture? How do you get this message across to the team that you have, that they play part of this? Some of it certainly is going to be around having policies, which is point 2. We've identified that these things are dangerous, therefore we have a policy to say you cannot do these things. You can put technical controls in place to stop them from doing those things. But unfortunately, emails still get through filters, and people will still click on them. Therefore, point 3, cyber awareness training is critical. If you're not doing it, please do it. You've got to give people a chance to understand. If they're kind of at the, if they're making part of your security arrangement by hoping that they don't click on something, show them what bad looks like, dangerous looks like, so that they've got a chance of not clicking on something, if that makes sense. And then, of course, if you're going to train people, then test it, do some simulated phishing, do some phishing, and do it regularly, because people then just become more and more used to looking at the emails that land, because it's typically an email, by the way, with an attachment, but it just depends on what type of email that's going to be. It could just be a very broad phishing email. It could be a more targeted sort of spear phishing email that's aimed at the individual, or it could just be coming from the supply chain. And those ones are often the ones that we see clicked on the most, which is it's come from someone I know with an attachment that I'm expecting to have, but it was their system that was hacked into. The email has come to me, I open it, it causes more damage. So you do need to test them. And in doing those things, training, testing it, bringing policy, you can increase the culture within or improve the culture within the organization. Number 4 is incident planning and response. And I'm going to just spend a little bit of time on this one. So there's 4 actions that they're asking for, but what we've done is put a couple of slides together just to sort of talk about, considerations in putting an incident response plan together. And again, judging by the responses that we had at the beginning to the poll, this hopefully will be useful. So what are they saying here? Number 1, ensure the organization has a plan to respond to and recover from a cyber incident. 2, test the plan at least annually. And I think, as I say, lots of businesses fall foul of number 1. They certainly fall foul of number 2. In the event of an incident, take responsibility for individual regulatory obligations and support executives in critical decision making and external communications. So a couple of things. Obviously, you're going to have a requirement to report this, potentially to your regulator, potentially to the ICO. So the first one is, do you know when you're meant to report something, when you're required to do so, and what it is that you need to tell them? And remember, if you're in the midst of a really strong cyber attack, businesses people within businesses tend not to think clearly because there's a panic. Clients have just received 10,000 emails, the systems are encrypted, something's going terribly wrong, and the first thing, what goes through your mind, and I'm just trying to build the picture of the stress that occurs, because I promise you it's incredibly stressful when this happens. You have to start thinking about what you're going to do. The press will get hold of it at some point. What if they ring your reception? What are you going to say to them? If you've got to tell your clients that their data has been breached, what are you going to say to them? If your staff can't carry out a piece of time critical work, if they're doing whatever it is, because of the attack, they've got to go to their client and say, I can't do this because of X, Y, and Z. And remember, the delivery of that message to your client is going to prompt further questions from them as well. What do you mean? What's happened to the rest of my data? When are we going to be back up online? And your response plan needs to be considerate of all of those things. And of course, if you do have an incident, you need to have a review process to lessons learned, if you like. What do we do going forward so that this doesn't happen again? And I think I probably said it, well, I know I said it earlier, but the time to make up this plan is not when you're going through an actual cyber event. So preparing an incident response plan. So I've touched on some of the key themes. In order to do that, you need to carry out your risk assessments. You need to understand what systems you've got in place, the people that are operating the various systems and who have access to it, and the data that you hold. You need to know where it is, who's got access to it, and how it all operates. So some of that information is readily available probably from your IT firm, but some of that is not. But you do need to have that in some form of document. Then you need to create a response team. So we define the roles. Now that's internally and externally. So for example, when we get a call from an organization that's in the midst of a cyber breach, obviously, if they're using an external IT company, we need to talk to them immediately. We also then need a clear line into the senior management of the business as well. So you need to start thinking about who's going to be the people that you contact. You know, what are the phone numbers, what are their email addresses. Then again, do you contact them by email? Because it could be that your business email has been corrupted and that the criminals are sitting inside your system, which kind of leads into point 2 here, is response guidelines around communication. So internal clients, press, regulators that I was talking about. But again, just think about how you're going to do it, because you know, if criminals are monitoring your email systems because they're in them, you don't want to be letting them know what you're now doing. Establish an emergency contact procedure. So again, sorry, that's the point around emails there, but also having phone numbers to hand, because it could be somebody who's on holiday that normally deals with your IT firm, for example. Well, if they're on holiday, who's going to pick that up? So just simple things like that. And then consider how you are going to define a risk. So if you've done your risk assessment and then you work out where some of your vulnerabilities lie, you can then sit there and say, well, if this happens, it would be quite low risk. Therefore, these are the things we're going to do. If this happens, that's bigger alarm bells that we need to consider. We've talked about training staff and retraining the response team. You really do need to test that plan, which is actually point 6 here, but train them in how to do it, but then do a dummy run through it. It doesn't have to be us, but you can use an external organization to do a practice incident, if you like, a desktop exercise where you can sit there and say, right, you know, you can bring your IT people together, you can bring the response team together, and then we could run the incident and we can sit there and say, right, this has just happened, what do you do? And then you can go to your plan and say, right, this is what the plan says we do. And then we can play it out and start to say, well, yep, that would work, or, oh no, hold on, no, this bit doesn't work. And that's the importance of testing it. Point 5 here is really important, because everybody, I would imagine most of you on this call will have some form of backup of your data. And recovery is really important, certainly in a ransomware attack. Under point A, the first thing is your backup needs to have a backup of not just data and software, but also the system configuration. What we actually find sometimes is that you're only backing up files and documents, so the data that you might send, you know, Excel spreadsheets, things like that. Actually, if your system has been encrypted, you're going to need the shelving, that's your system configuration, yeah, where all the files sit, and that also needs to be backed up. So you need to make sure that that's being done correctly so that you can run that backup or spin that back up pretty quickly. The location of the storage, is it on premise? Is it, you know, where's it being held and who's got it, and how, you know, how secure is that backup? Is that easily exposed by cyber criminals or infiltrated by criminals? And again, that comes back down to, I guess, point C, looking at how often it's being done. The memory capacity, that's an important one. We've seen ransomware encryption codes go into backups, and then just there's so much information in them that it just overwrites all of the backup as well. So yeah, so backups are pretty important, and testing, as I've already mentioned. And then, of course, there's the deployment of the plan. So that's kind of things you need to consider in getting the plan together when it starts to happen. six kind of stages that we'd recommend you go through. So it's the identification. Is it a real security event? What has actually happened? You know, and that's where you need good advice quickly. Far too often we have organizations that come to us where what they've done is they've recognized that there is some form of cyber attack happening to them, and then they've gone to their IT provider, and the IT provider has said, right, I've changed the password, or I've logged you out, or I've done this, I've done that. And a couple of hours later, or even the next day or a week later, the problem is still existing. And it's at that point where we find organizations coming to us and explaining it, and the damage has been done because it's not been identified as what's actually happened. So the threat continues within the organization because it's not been, you know, you've not had somebody that knows what they're doing looking at it, to be quite frank. Because at that point, once you can identify it, then you can look at how you contain it. Because obviously, if it's part of a system that's been affected, then we can look at that. But we also need to understand what other parts of it are affected or not, as the case may be. If we isolate it, we can deal with it. It makes life a lot easier. Finding the root cause is vital. Quite often, again, we'll see organizations where passwords have been changed or things have been done, but they never really got to the cause of why it happened. Was it somebody that clicked on something, which is, you know, often the root cause of it? And if so, then, you know, why did the system allow that to happen? Because there should have been other things that mitigated that. Or is it that, I don't know, they've got into a laptop, an endpoint remotely, or they've gone through a firewall, or they've gone into a cloud system, or whatever that might look like. So you do need to understand the root cause of how people get in to stop that happening again. I think that's pretty obvious. Categorization and reporting determine exactly what data or assets have been accessed or stolen. You're certainly going to need that if you're reporting. If you're reporting the breach to the ICO or your regulator, and you're certainly going to need to know the answer if you're going to tell your clients, because you're going to have to, that their data has been or may have been compromised. And remember, they're really going to want to know what data has been compromised. So that's vital. What that requires, though, is a really good sort of back-end setup of your systems. When we go in and we carry out an audit of that, if they're not set up properly, sometimes we can struggle to understand exactly what data has been compromised, and you do need those logs sat there in place. Recovery, allow the affected systems back into normal operation after ensuring that no threat remains. So we've seen this be quite a big problem in the past, because sometimes businesses are working with third parties in their systems that they share information, and the third parties won't allow them to interact or re-engage until those systems have been signed off as clean, if you like, and that there's no threat in there. Again, you're often going to need a cyber risk management specialist to sit there and guarantee or should tell you that there are no criminals left in your systems. And then it's lessons learned. You know, the truth is if you get the first bit right at the beginning phase of incident response, which is carry out a risk assessment, the chances are this isn't going to happen. And actually, even if it does, you know, it's not going to be as bad as it could be. So to get to this point would generally be because you've either not done the risk assessment or the risk assessment has missed something. So there's quite a lot of food for thought there, I recognise. But again, if you download these slides after the session, it's something for you to be able to take away. The fifth element, if you like, of the code is assurance and oversight. And again, I think this just speaks to the essence of the code, of a governance code of practice, really. So number one, establish a governance structure defining roles and responsibilities of cyber resilience at executive and non-executive level. Establish a regular monitoring process of the organisation's cyber resilience and review mitigations and strategy. Establish regular two-way dialogue with relevant senior managers. Formal reporting at least quarterly. determine how internal assurance will be achieved, and ensure the cyber resilience strategy is integrated across the existing external and internal assurance mechanisms. And what that leads on to mean is, you know, if you've got 27,001, is how does that cyber resilience fit into that? If you've got cyber essentials, how does it fit into that? If you've got your own policies, how does that fit into that? And other things. Often, in our opinion, this is where businesses need the most help, because frankly, there's two things that you require here. One is time, and two is expertise. And actually, if you've got the time to do it yourself and even the expertise, have you got independence? Are you marking your own homework? Are your IT marking their own homework? Just from a compliance perspective, that's a bit of a non-starter anyway. So in our view, get some external help from subject matter experts like us, who are independent, who can give you guidance to say, look, these are the things that you should be doing. I appreciate time is pressing on. I've just got a couple more slides and then we'll take some questions. This is moving on from the code of practice, and it's just to touch on something again that came out last month. And I wanted to put some comments here around the Home Office have proposed to ban ransomware payments, but this is to reduce them in regard to or to ban them in public sector. So local government, critical national infrastructure, schools, NHS, to say that they will not be able to pay ransomware payments. Well, why is that relevant to you in the private sector? Well, let's just understand what the three objectives are. The first is to ban the payments to them. The second is a ransomware payment prevention regime. So this would put a requirement on private sector to inform the government that, or whoever, whichever body they set up, to inform them that they are going to pay a ransom. And the third is a mandatory reporting regime for ransomware incidents, again for private sector. Why is that important? Again, right, let's just think about it. It's well intentioned when you think about it, because if the government aren't going to pay, our government institutions won't pay ransoms, that's a good thing. There's no money coming out of our pockets to pay it, which inevitably it will be. But let's just have a think about it. In reality, the overwhelming majority of all ransomware attacks are on businesses in the private sector, not on government bodies. You go back to the stats I went earlier, 50% of firms have been victims of these crimes. If cyber attackers know that the public sector are not going to pay ransoms, then I would imagine that's going to redirect them to the private sector, because if you're allowed to pay them, then that's where I would aim if I was a criminal. If you are obliged to report your intention to pay a ransom, that body, we recognise, will be giving you advice on whether you're allowed to pay that ransom. And you might say, well, how could that be blocked? Well, what if it's with a country, the criminals are based in a country with which there are sanctions? Then you're not going to be able to pay. And I think that commercially, that could be a big problem. You know, you've got a stressful situation where your data is being held to ransom, or your systems are being held to ransom. You are considering paying that ransom in order that you can get back up and running, and then actually you're told that you can't. That could be the difference between surviving and not, in our opinion. So that could be, again, well-intentioned, but it could lead to some further problems. I think the other thing here is, you might not be paying the ransoms out, but they're going to steal data. Data theft is generally nowadays the far bigger issue with regards to a ransomware attack, because they might not be able to, you've got a lot of cloud systems, so they won't be able to cripple you in the way that they used to. But if they steal your data and threaten to publish that or sell that, then you've got a bigger problem, and they'll just go and flog that on the dark web. So that's a huge problem. But I think the elephant in the room here is this is about ransomware. By volume and by a long way, the biggest problem is to do with email account takeover, which is it can lead to ransomware attacks, but actually having your emails taken over, compromised, where they can get try and trick your clients into paying fake invoices or whatever, or stealing data. That by volume is far more than ransom. So, is it going to have a massive impact? I'm not convinced it will be massive, but you can see some of the considerations that you're going to need to consider. So what's the bottom line? Final slide before we take some questions. Maybe prioritizing prevention of a cyber breach in the first place is a good idea, which obviously I would say that, but I think we can all see that from what we've talked about today. Cyber risk management should be somewhere near the top of your risk register, and this is a board level responsibility. The government are now, are about to release a code of conduct that says this is what you that you need to do, and if you don't, then they're going to probably increase. They pull the levers in other ways with legislation. So I guess it's a fair warning. So there we go. So thank you for listening. I've probably gone on a little bit longer than I was meant to. Sorry, David. But we can take some questions if you like.
Yeah, absolutely fine, Kerry. Yeah, no, we've certainly still got a few minutes for some questions. The first question that I've got is, obviously you've talked about the code there being for board level responsibility and such like. Does that mean that the code is only going to apply to large companies or public interest companies, or is it applicable to all sizes and shapes of organizations?
So what they've turned around so far and said, look, 50 staff and above is where we are going to aim. But I think that doesn't preclude businesses with less than 50 staff for two reasons. One is generally smaller firms have less cyber risk management in place, so they're more likely to be the victim of an attack. So it's probably more important that they do that. But also, I don't see why the ICO won't be looking at that as a code of that code of practice either way. So they do recognise slightly bigger organisations, but I'm not convinced that that's right.
I mean, it certainly makes sense to me in terms of the general principles that are set out within the code. Should be applicable to any size of business. But so I think you're absolutely right. Obviously, the ICO may well then expect that broadly to be applied proportionately and in response, depending upon your resources and all the rest of it for other organisations as well. You talked about risk assessments and training and such like. Does the code give any suggestions as to how often that should be getting carried out, or is that again just left up to businesses to decide themselves?
So that's generally no, they haven't given clear guidance on that. Rule of thumb. So if we were advising an organisation, the first thing is undertake your risk assessment. That sometimes then gives you a better picture of how often you should be doing some of the things. If you've got things that are really critical, then you would risk assess those more often. But I think if you want a basic rule of thumb, at least once a year is where we need to be on it. But again, your risk assessment will tell you if it needs to be more often than that. You certainly wouldn't wait, you'd have a big assessment done over time, but certainly somewhere in between, you might want to have a check that everything is doing what it should be doing. But again, you've got to start somewhere. So start annually and see where you go from there.
That's great. Got another question here, which I'm hoping maybe means something more to you than it does to me. But it says, does the code apply to OT cyber sector as well?
Operating technology. So you've got think manufacturing, things like that. So for those of you who love what was it, hula hoops, I think about a year ago, KP had a huge, I think it's KP that do hula hoops, they had a big cyber attack and it brought down their supply chain. So hula hoops were in short demand at some point. So it's aimed at businesses. It's not aimed at sectors specifically. I would suggest those that have got big OT as part of an important part of their infrastructure. You want to be looking at that anyway, because effectively, if your operating technology goes down, you can't work anyway. So that's probably just a good idea, let alone whether you've got a code of practice.
And just going back to the incident response plan as well, I mean, I guess a lot of people tend to now operate within the cloud and possibly think, if all my data's in the cloud and all the rest of it, then there isn't the same threat to me because I can't get my systems locked down in the same way. Is that right?
No, the cloud. If you think about it, most cybercrime now is operating in the cloud, and you might say, well, how so? Well, I bet every organisation here uses Office 365 for their email. Okay, they might use SharePoint, they might use the other bits and bobs, like OneDrive, things like that come with it. Those are all cloud-based systems, yeah, and we're connecting to various other bits of data here, there, and everywhere. That makes it life, I'm not going to say easier for criminals, but it's a different way of getting to it. And the majority of attacks that we see are infiltrating cloud systems nowadays, and not on premise, because fewer businesses have on premise. Yeah, that's just the way that the world has changed. So no, if you think that cloud systems are secure, well, I would ask you this: what risk assessment process have you been through to confirm that you are secure and that no risk exists? Yeah.
Good question to be asking. And I think often, I guess people when they're deciding to purchase or subscribe to software probably don't actually go down that route and ask the supplier exactly what is their processes, what security do they have in place. We just assume that because they're a large multinational that they'll have appropriate technologies in place for that. So
Yeah,
good question. Yeah, I think.
I think just to bring that alive a little bit more, because actually it's probably, it's a really good question. Think about, we've heard people turn to us and go, right, I use Microsoft Office 365 for my emails. Well, Microsoft aren't going to get hacked, is what we hear. So my systems must be safe. No, they sell you a product which needs configuring. And it needs to be configured in two ways. One is operationally, and that's what your IT company do, is they make it work so that you can send emails and store documents in various places and move information around. But the second then is to do it securely. And there are all manner of tools that sit within the technology that you purchase, which generally by default are switched off. And if they're switched off, you need to understand what to switch on. And what we find is that IT companies will turn some of it on. So MFA, for example. But let's say, as I've mentioned earlier, you can get around MFA. Well, we also know that most cyber criminals operate outside of the UK. So we might need to consider that if somebody is trying to log into your email account out from a geographical location outside of the UK, that's also banned. And there are numerous other things that you can consider. But that's the point. You have to consider all of those things to work out who's accessing, where they're accessing from, and what they're accessing from, i.e. what type of device. So there's quite a lot that you need to consider. And then, of course, bring into account the people that are operating it as well.
Absolutely. Kenny, we are going to have to draw it to a close just now because we are running out of time. But thanks very much once again for all your knowledge and experience on that. We do have just put a quick poll up there. So if you wouldn't mind rating today's webinar, your feedback is always useful to us. And while you're doing that, just a quick reminder about some of the webinars and events which are coming up, which you might be interested in. So in just a couple of weeks' time, on the 11th of March, my colleague Chris Campbell will be joined by Tony Cochrane from VAT and Indirect Tax Advisors to get an update on all the latest developments and news in the world of VAT. Chris will also be back again on the 25th of March, so 1 month from today. This time joined by some of the top brass from HMRC's MTD team. So that'll be with Craig Ogilvie, Director of MTD, and Sam Wood, who's their MTD Agent Engagement Team Lead. And they'll be discussing how to get involved and planning and preparation for MTD ITSA. We also have a couple of in-person events coming up across the country. And we have some of them in association with Sage. Now, I know that a lot of those locations, in fact, maybe even all those locations now, I think I saw an email just before I came on here suggesting that all those locations are now at capacity, but there is some availability in terms of a waiting list if you want to do that. And if sustainability is your thing, then why not join us at the ICAS Sustainability Summit in London on the 23rd of April. And looking slightly further into the future, you really don't want to miss our practice conference, Thrive in 2025, which this year is being held in Glasgow on the 11th of June. Details of all those events and how to sign up are in the events section of the new icas.com website. So that, of course, I think really just leaves me to thank Kerry once again, and of course you, the audience, for joining us on the webinar today. And until the next time, goodbye.